You think this will go to Ofcom and a big fine is on its way?
I would have thought so, yes. And Ofcom have already intervened, really, because normally the BBC does its own investigation and then it goes to Ofcom. But Ofcom did intervene yesterday, saying they were going to take action.
And this is the Times at 1 with Andrew Neil. The BBC and its Director General are in the spotlight again, and not in a good way. Politicians, regulators, licence payers, they want to know why it live-streamed on the iPlayer, the Bob Vylan Act, which included an anti-Semitic rant and calls for death to the IDF. Could have recorded it for broadcast after editing. It could have run it on a delay. It could have pulled the plug when it was clear what was happening on stage. But none of the above happened. It went out live in all its glory and remained available on catch-up for 5 hours until somebody decided it might be a good idea to take it down. Yet another crisis for the BBC as it heads into an intense period of charter renewal. Roger Mosley, former head of BBC TV News, is with me now. Roger, the BBC had over 400 people at Glastonbury, yet not one was able to take the decision that it now says it should have taken, pull the plug. Sounds to me that's a pretty top-heavy, overmanned, dysfunctional organisation.
It's a terrible mess, Andrew. And I think if you look at, I think the fundamental thing was not getting the due diligence right about whether this band were the right ones to put on live on BBC platforms at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And I saw a sort of grimly amusing piece on the BBC website this morning where they said, people say due diligence was done. Well, if it was, it came to the wrong conclusion. These people should not have been broadcast live. Now, I think in fairness to the BBC, and I have not been briefed by the BBC on technicalities, this is what I know from a few years back, it is difficult. You can stop a live feed, which clearly they didn't. And they didn't because I think they had literally seconds to decide that Free Palestine as a chant is okay, but death to the IVF is not. And at that point, you probably have a music or entertainment producer having to make that decision on the spot. So I can understand why it was a very difficult live call. But then you've got the issue that things are uploaded to the BBC iPlayer. So there's not just a live stream, but also things go onto servers. And I think technically it probably is a bit difficult to download them from a server and stop them being broadcast instantly. But the BBC was unquestionably slow and pedestrian in its response.
Where does this leave Tim Davie, the Director General, whose role or non-role in this is given an added piquancy by the fact that he was at Glastonbury?
Yes, I mean, look, I think that Tim Davie has done a lot of good things for the BBC. If you look at the growth of the iPlayer, a spectacular Christmas Day schedule last year, getting the BBC in shape for a digital future, he's done pretty well. And I think that the challenges are more, as you started from, systemic in the BBC. It's a big organisation. You have to be sure your teams are making the right calls. And what's been happening recently is there have been clear examples like this, putting these people on live, like the Gaza documentary, where some of Tim's lieutenants have got things wrong. Now, I think where I would fault him a bit is that the response has not always been very sure-footed. I think BBC Press Office statements are in a class of their own for being disingenuous and not particularly helpful. But is that a reason for Tim to lose his job? No, but the BBC needs to get its act together, and he is responsible for ultimately making sure that happens.
So if not the DG, and I understand what you're saying, will anybody at the BBC carry the can for this, or will it just be the usual buck passing or deputy heads rolling?
Well, they've just got to get the decisions right. I mean, again, one of the things in their statements yesterday was saying we're going to look again at processes. The processes are very clear here, which is that you make an assessment about whether these people should go on air, which shouldn't have happened. Once it does happen on air, you apologise, which they didn't do. You also try to remedy as far as you can, which they were slow on. And yesterday's press statement was this sort of meander through, well, millions of people enjoyed Glastonbury, it was all great. Oh, and by the way, we're sorry about this bit. And, you know, the BBC needs to be more accountable. And in particular, you know, not a single BBC current responsible executive has appeared on air in the last 72 hours. And that, if you're supposed to be the most accountable public service broadcaster in the world, you need to put yourself up and be questioned about it. Whether that's Tim or the head of music or whoever, somebody should have taken accountability for it.
In addition to the death chant, the Bob Vylan Act involved a constant stream of swearing. Not just the F word, but the C word. I mean, has the BBC just given up trying to police this? Is it just something licence payers now have to accept, even in daytime afternoon programming?
No, and it was completely wrong to put these people on air at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And I think the BBC is heading for a very, very big fine from Ofcom because it simply wasn't compliant. So, it's all very well. The BBC has slightly implied, oh, well, we're just covering Glastonbury and Glastonbury happens. But they make a decision about what goes on air and what's on the iPlayer. And they took the wrong decisions and then responded too slowly to it. So the BBC has quite a lot to answer for here. And if you are covering a live event, you need to be absolutely on the button. I mean, I haven't covered music events, but I was responsible for a lot of sport in my time.
Indeed,
and the issues
I
in
remember.
sport can be things like swearing. Quite often sports people swear when they've just done something amazing, or you can get crowd trouble. And you've got to be watching and alert to those things the whole time. And Ofcom and regulators and the audience are pretty angry with you if you let people say words like that and there's no redress or apology for it.
The BBC is in a position where it investigates itself complaints against it, but they can then be escalated up to Ofcom, which is outside of the BBC. And you think, from what you just said a couple of minutes ago, you think this will go to Ofcom and a big fine is on its way?
I would have thought so, yes. And Ofcom have already intervened, really, because normally the BBC does its own investigation and then it goes to Ofcom. But Ofcom did intervene yesterday, saying they were going to take action. And also, look, I think there is, as you know, Andrew, a certain amount of political grandstanding around this as well. But there's no doubt that Lisa Nandy and the government are playing quite tough on it too. So the BBC
They're
is
not natural enemies of the BBC.
So say again?
They're not natural enemies of the BBC.
No, they're not. They're not natural enemies. But I think that you can look. There is inevitably out of a music festival going to be content that's contentious, and politicians should not be micromanaging and running the BBC. But I think this is a basic BBC accountability. How did it happen and why? Who is going to accept responsibility? And I don't mean losing their job. I just mean say, actually, we got this wrong, and identify what it was that happened. And by political grandstanding, I think that you can, of course, make a wider complaint about Glastonbury about, it's got a particular kind of audience and it's got a particular kind of bands. Well, that is something that is inherent in the nature of the event. And the BBC has to seek impartiality over a broader canvas than just one music festival in Somerset.
Final question, a broader one for you, Roger. When the BBC runs into trouble over the Middle East, it's nearly always for being seen to be too pro-Palestinian and too anti-Israel. Why is that?
Well, the biggest mistakes have been in that area. And obviously, the documentary on Gaza, narrated by a 13-year-old, was a terrible mistake, and the BBC shouldn't have done it. I think, in fairness, the documentary then that they pulled, so they pulled a documentary about Gaza and doctors, which is now going to be shown on Channel 4 tomorrow night. And people are saying, well, look, the BBC is not covering Gaza and is cowing to the Israeli lobby there. So the BBC is caught between those two poles. I think it does need to take a look at this Middle East coverage, but I do not believe the BBC is systemically biased on the Middle East. I think it's made mistakes it shouldn't have done, but is it at its core fundamentally pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli? No, I don't think it is.
Roger, we'll leave it there. Thanks for joining me today. Roger Mosley, former head of BBC TV News.